Here we're going to continue disassembling the front forks from a 23 ZX4RR. So the first step is to remove the inner fork tube from the strachan. In order to do that, we use this special tool that clamps onto the inner fork tube, and you torque it pretty tight. You don't want to bend the fork tube, of course, but you've got to get it on there snug, so make sure you use the right size diameter one. This tube is a 37 millimeters. You can see mine's a 37. Once you've got that torqued on there, just make sure to remove the set screw if there is one from the bottom of the leg. And then all you're going to have to do is see if it'll come loose. If not, and in most cases it's not, you're just going to see it spin. What you're going to want to do is snug up the fork tube tool a little tighter. And then you're going to want to take and get your propane torch out and get some heat into the bottom of that fork leg. So we're going to heat that up now to soften the Loctite, and we'll just put that on high speed. This takes quite a while to do. You want to go slowly and warm it up. You don't want it to get too hot because there's seals and O-rings in there that you don't want to damage. Once that's heated up, you can take and spin the fork tube out. It's a lot easier to do. And just unthread this all the way until your inner fork tube comes out. Once you've got this unthreaded enough, you're going to be able just to grab hold of the inner fork tube and lift it right out of the steering assembly. Take off the tool now because you're done using it for a little while, and you can go ahead and finish the disassembly of any parts that are left inside the tube. In my case, everything's already been removed, so we don't need that tool anymore. We can set it aside, and now with the tube removed, we can set the knuckle aside as well. We're not going to need that for a while either. At this point in time, you're pretty much ready to start rebuilding your parts, but we do have to clean the Loctite off of the fork tubes. So I like to use a little brass brush. I've got one here on my drill that makes pretty quick work of this. So we're just going to take the fork tube and run the brass brush over the threads to get all of the Loctite off of there and give them a clean up. This is going to make reinstalling it a lot easier, and it's going to allow a nice clean new surface to put the new Loctite on. Just make sure to be gentle and clean the threads all the way around. Once you've wire brushed everything here and got all the thread lock out, go ahead and just make sure it's good and clean. Get a little rag and give it a little wipe just to make sure everything's good. Now we're going to get ready to install the fork tube. I'm doing the right side with the ABS sensor first. So go ahead and throw that in a vise and make sure that you get the correct outer fork tube in order to put in here. The correct one is the one with 2 holes at the top. You'll also notice if you look inside, there's no little ledge where that piston cartridge sat in. So this is the right fork tube. And on the right hand side, we're going to install the rebound cartridge. The general rule is rebound on the right. So we'll start by spinning off the cap from the cartridge here. Just be careful that once you get this off, you don't lose your dampening rod or anything that's on the inside. So now you take and set the cartridge on a hard surface, nice and clean. We'll slide the inner fork tube over top. At the bottom there is an O-ring, so just slide it down gently and give a little push to get the O-ring seated in. Once that's seated, we're just going to screw the cap back onto the top. We're just putting this on there to make sure we don't lose any parts inside. And now that cartridge is ready to be screwed back into the leg. So take some Loctite, blue just like what we removed, shake it up good. From the factory, these had a pretty good amount of Loctite on the threads, so we're going to put a good amount as well. I always like to try and keep it factory that way as possible, so get a good amount of Loctite going here and spread it all the way around all the threads. It's really important that this tube stays seated really well, so just make sure that's spread out nicely. And once that's on there, we're just going to take and drop it into the knuckle and tighten it down by hand as far as we can go. Once you get that tightened all the way up, go ahead and get the inner fork tube tool that you had before, and we're going to get that snug. So here we are again with the fork tube tool. So again, you open up this tool, making sure you have the right size adapter inside. Tighten up really good onto the fork tube. Just make sure it clears the support for your fairing. You don't want to break anything off. You can see here I hold onto the inner fork tube while I crank it tight to make it really snug. And then I'm going to take and have to tighten this on. So my desk isn't screwed in, so I'll hold the desk with one foot and tighten this until the tool starts to slide on the inner fork tube. Once you notice the tool is sliding on the fork tube, you can try and tighten the bolt a little bit more, maybe an eighth or a quarter of a turn, and just get on there again to make sure it's as tight as it's going to go into that knuckle. You don't want this coming off while you're riding. There is a torque spec and an adapter you can get for this tool to make sure you've got them tight enough. I don't have that, so I'm just going to rely on good and tight with some Loctite. So now that it's on, as tight as I can get it, I'll remove this tool. I'm done with that, so I can set it aside. You'll find that if you apply the right amount of Loctite, that you're going to have just a little oozing out, so we wipe that up before moving on with the rest of the assembly of the fork. So the cartridge is now installed. Now that your cartridge is in, you can start rebuilding the fork. So you're going to need new fork seals. I went with SKF low stiction seals just to give a little bit. You can use the OEM ones if you want, but I prefer to use these green ones. They tend to last a little longer for me. The first thing we're going to do to install these seals is remove the cap from the top of the cartridge so that we can slide these seals on without them getting stuck on it. With the cap off, we'll just set that to the side and we'll go ahead and remove the dampening rod out of the cartridge as well. Now there's a lot of sharp edges on these outer fork tubes, as you can see, things your seals can get caught on and damage them. So just take some black electrical tape and go ahead and wrap that around your fork to cover up all of these edges. I like to start at the bottom and work my way up. So you have to overlap it, maybe about 30% overlap for the tape, and just work your way up the fork tube. We're just going to cover off all these sharp metal edges. I like to go a couple times around the middle here where the bushing fits because it's a little lower recessed, and then just continue that all the way up to the top, making sure you're covering the entire tube and all of the porting holes. Once you've got your tape on there, making sure it's covering everything really well, I like to take a little bit of the fork oil I'm going to use to apply the seals, and I like to lubricate the tape that I just put on. It just makes the seals slide over a little bit better. I'm also going to take a little bit of this fork oil and I'm going to take and apply it to the seals as well. We don't want them to get stuck or rip on anything or have any fluid leaks, so we'll just smooth that out on the inside of both of these seals. And now we're ready to go ahead and start installing them. So we're going to start with the dust cover. So the dust cover is going to go on first. Just pull that over top of your fork tube and slide it down to the bottom. After the dust cover comes your oil seal. There is an upper and a down to this. You can see there's a deeper groove on one side than the other. The deeper groove is your oil gallery, so you're going to want to make sure that deeper groove points up. So go ahead and slide that on next. Again, be very careful over those edges. Now we can remove the tape. It really only helps with those seals. The rest of the parts we're putting on, the tape will get in the way, and it's just not going to be needed as they're all metal parts, so there's nothing to rip. So get that tape off of there. And we'll put our washer on. Remember, this washer's curved, so there's a flat side which goes up and the curved side goes down. So put that in place. And now we can put our outer guide bushing on. It's really loose and just slides over the whole tube. So we'll drop that in place. And then there's the inner guide bushing. You have to stretch that a little bit and slide it down into that first groove where it's going to snap into place. Now that you've got all those parts on, the fork is ready to go into the outer tube. So we'll just make a little space here. The easiest way to do this is to dump your fork out first, because under that dampening rod is a little needle and a spring. With everything removed, we can now go ahead and clamp our outer fork tube upside down into our soft jaw vise to work on it. So this doesn't have to be too snug. It's just a lot easier to do it this way. So now that we've got our tube there, we're going to take our inner fork tube with all of our seals and everything built up on it, and we're going to slide it down. This should all go in pretty easily. And once you've got this all set in place with your oil seal set in the bottom, the next step is to grab a fork seal driver. I have this kit here that I got on Amazon. It doesn't have a 37 millimeter, but it does have this 35-36, which seems to fit pretty good for this purpose. Not perfect, but it's going to be fine. So slide your oil seal down and hold your tube up, and then you're going to get your fork seal driver on. Lots of these kits look different, so yours may be a little bit different than mine, but the technique is the same. It's a little awkward to do this with this size, but that's all right. So now that we've got the fork seal driver on top of it, you hold on to the metal part and you pound the fork seal down into the tube. It doesn't take a whole lot of force, and once it's in, you'll have exposed a little ledge in there. Take your driver out of the way, take your retaining clip. It just snaps in place over the fork tube. I like to use a little screwdriver here, and all you're doing is pushing that clip down on top of the oil seal. You'll hear it click in place, and you'll see that it's moved itself to seat into that little recess, and that's how you know you've got that in the right place. If you can't click it in, then you might have to drive your oil seal a little bit deeper. The next thing you do is install the dust seal. It's a really similar process to the oil seal, so we'll just speed through that quick here. With the oil seal fully installed, the last thing you need to do is install the dust cap. There's a couple different ways to do this depending on what fits, so usually use the fork seal driver again. Sometimes you can turn it upside down and pound that into place. Sometimes that doesn't work. And once you've got that seated, however you manage to, I always like to go by afterwards with a little bit of a rubber mallet and just kind of tap the edges of that dust seal to make sure it's fully seated. Once you flip the forks over, we're going to put this dampening rod tool on. This is going to help us to stroke the dampening rod once we start filling it with oil, because now we can start actually filling the fork and getting our oil level set. So go ahead and take the proper grade of oil for your forks and just open that up. And what you're going to do here is just pour the oil into the inner fork tube nice and slowly. You're going to hear all kinds of air gurgling. Just be careful when you pour it in. You don't want to go past the top of the fork tube. Once you've filled up the inner fork tube with oil about 80% of the way, what you're going to do is start stroking your dampening rod. So you're going to pull the dampening rod up and down, repeating that process as long as you hear air bubbles. In between that, just top up your fork oil as you need to make sure that you're still sitting at that 80% level. Once you're no longer hearing any air bubbles coming out of the fork tube, the next step is to take a little spacer tool. I like to use this one here, and I just prop the dampening rod up a little bit with that and let it sit for about 20 minutes to let gravity do its thing and make sure that I've gotten all the air out. Now that we've let that sit and we know there's no air in, we're going to head and remove the spacer tool that was propping that up. I've transferred this over to my fork spring compressor to finish this up. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this level tool and drops into the fork tube. I've already set this to the measurement on the cartridge kit, which was 140 millimeters. You just pull the syringe and suck all the excess fluid out. Once I have a full syringe, I like to just take off the tube and I'll put the fork oil back into my jug because this is new fork oil that hasn't been used, so no sense throwing it out. You're just going to keep repeating this process until you get nothing but air. And once your syringe is pulling nothing but air, that means your fork level is set and you're good. Now that you've got your fork oil level set correctly, the next step is to put the spring into the fork and drop that into the inner tube and get it all the way down. We're then going to pick up the spacer, make sure the holes are at the top. That goes on top of the spring, and then your fork spring compressor attaches to that. So you just adjust these two pins to pinch those two holes. Now that I've got the fork spring compressor holding the spacer, I can go ahead and crank down the fork spring compressor until the spring and the spacer are just visible on top of the fork tube. That's going to give me enough room so that when I grab this tool here, I can pull up on my dampening rod holder and slide this tool underneath the nut. That's going to keep tension on this entire assembly, and then I can remove the dampening rod tool. Now that the dampening rod tool is removed, we can grab our fork cap and we'll go ahead and set the phase, which is the number of turns in that the adjuster goes. These forks are a phase of 4, so from all the way counterclockwise, we're going to turn the inner Allen key 4 complete rotations. And that's how this brand of cartridge calibrates what it calls its phase. So this cap's ready to be installed now. The next step you do by hand, you spin the fork cap all the way onto the dampening rod until it just snugs up and stops at the bottom. It's okay if it's not quite touching the nut. You'll see there's a little gap between the nut and the cap. So what you do here is take two 17 mils, one wrench and one ratchet or a pair of wrenches. And what you're going to do is hold the nut with one, and you're going to take and tighten the preload down until that touches the nut. You don't need a lot of tension at all, just till they touch, and then a little bit more to make them snug is all you need. Now you can remove the spacer, letting the fork cap come down, and we can go ahead and remove the tension from our spring compression tool. So we'll unthread that all the way, and you'll know that you've got that right when the spacer is a little bit loose. You can now take and remove the pins from the spacer to remove the compression tool from that. And now you can just slide the outer fork tube all the way up and thread it a couple of turns onto the cap. Get it all the way up to the washer if you can, to make sure you're not going to lose any fork oil. At this point in time, we're just tightening the outer fork tube onto the cap by hand. We're not going to use any tools. When the fork tube goes back on the bike, then we're going to use a ratchet and we're going to tighten the outer fork tube onto the cap at that point in time.